Phyllis Geller. We're in Washington, D.C. It's August 9th, and the interviewer is Linda Lewitt. So, Phyllis, first let's just start with some of their basic questions here. I wonder if you can tell me just a little biographical information about yourself.
Sure. I grew up in Massachusetts, and I went to college in Massachusetts. I went to Smith College, and I had always done theater as a child. Okay, I was a little actress, and they called me Little Sarah Bernhardt, as I'm sure they call every little girl who likes to perform. And so all through grammar school and high school and summer camp, I always acted and sang. And when I went to college, I was, first of all, at a women's college, but we'll come back to that. But I thought I'd have to major in English, because what else did women do in those days? You majored in English and you hoped to get some sort of job in, publishing or something. But one day I wandered into the theater department, which was in an old gym. They were going to build a new theater, and in the meantime they were having theater in this wretched old building. But there were these people doing plays and taking it very seriously. And I thought, I could do a play. Wouldn't that be fun? Like I had always done it for fun. And I did. And lo and behold, it wasn't just a hobby for people. It was actually a vocation. So I realized that I didn't have to be an English major. And I called up my parents and I said, I really want to major in theater. And I thought that, that might not go over too well, but they were great. So that's what I did. I majored in theater and went to New York when I graduated, and got the obligatory job as a secretary, or receptionist or whatever, and waitressing, so that I could go to auditions and be an actress. But that, after about a year of that, it wore very, very thin. And I didn't know what I was going to do, because acting was all I had ever wanted to do, or felt that was me, felt that was really my core thing. So I took off and traveled around Europe a little bit, and came back, and I got a job. A friend of mine was working at National Educational Television. And so this was educational television before there was a PBS, because this was 1969, long time ago. And she was working as a researcher or something, but there was a job as a secretary in the engineering department. So I took that just to get in, and because I needed a job. So there was this row of secretaries, and it was an absolute column of secretaries outside the offices. All these women, overeducated, overqualified for these secretarial positions, and all the men in their offices. And it was the late 60s. It's 1969 and early 1970, and the women's movement is starting up, and nobody's wearing a bra. And the men would come out of their offices like this, because they were just too embarrassed because the women were not wearing bras. And in the meantime, what the women were doing, since we all wanted to move up, we were only there as we wanted to move up. That was what you wanted to do. And the frustrating thing was that in that corporate environment, whenever there was a production job available, the next rung would have been production assistant. And whenever there was a PA job available, they would just hire somebody from the outside, and you never even knew it was available. So we started a movement. We started the women's group of NET at the time. And my boss, who was the head of engineering, there was absolutely nothing to do in engineering. They didn't have a studio or anything. We used to bicycle tapes. This is how long ago it was. They would have these 2-inch tapes, and they would get bicycled from station to station of the public television stations around the country, and they'd make their copy and send it on to the next station. So we really are going back. But so that's all the so-called engineering department did. So my boss used to say to me, could you file these letters, but it's okay. When you finish typing your manifesto, just do what you can. And that's what I was doing. I was organizing this women's group. And our demands, we had a sit-in on the floor of the office of the Vice President of Human Resources. And this poor man arrived in his office one day to find these women sitting on the floor in hot pants, because that's what you wore, and it was New York in the summer, and it was really hot. Hot pants and halters. I don't know how we got away with it. But it was only better than miniskirts because at least in the hot pants you could bend over to the bottom file cabinet. In a miniskirt, you were in deep trouble if you tried to do that. So the great thing was we got our demand. We said, look, you have to let people know internally if a job is available. This is discriminatory against women because all the lower level jobs are women. And give us a chance. And don't open it up to the outside until 3 days or whatever. So they actually passed this policy. And years later, I'll jump ahead a bit, but years later, like 10, 12 years later, I moved to LA and I went to KCET, the LA public television station. And the human resources people were walking me through the employee handbook. And lo and behold, there was the same policy. They had adopted it. Any open job has to be announced internally for 3 days, etc. And I got a little twinge because I thought, oh my God, we did that. We actually made that happen, and it spread throughout these different stations. So those are the little moments that make you feel like the fight was worth it in those early days. But so at NET, I finally did get a job in production and worked on a wonderful series called The Great American Dream Machine. It was one of the first magazine programs.
For a second.
Yeah.
So this is before KCET.
Oh yeah, this is.
Okay, and roll again. So how did the system work then? They're bicycling the
Public
tapes,
television?
But yeah, like what was the environment like in the production world, and how did you get into that first job then?
Public television was a loose collection of educational stations at that time. It was in 1967 that the Carnegie Commission that Johnson held the Carnegie Commission that established public broadcasting as such. So, and that took taxpayer money, put it through Congress into public broadcasting. So the system, as it turned into PBS, didn't really start until 71, I think. I could be wrong about the date that PBS actually was created. So until then, this National Educational Television, NET, in New York was the center. It produced some things, not a lot. It was a lot of British imports, some productions. You didn't have the major series that started a few years later, Masterpiece Theater, and those series came later. In the 70s, when the oil companies got involved as sponsors. Once PBS was set up, there was a national network, and some significant sponsors got involved. We called it, Petroleum Broadcasting System, PBS in those days. And you were only frustrated if you didn't have an oil company, because WGBH got Mobil, New York got Exxon, and I'm jumping again, but when I went to KCET, they had thought in the 70s that KCET would have ARCO. Well, we all know what happened to ARCO. So it was very, very difficult for KCET to compete ultimately with New York and Boston, who had established these series, these signature series with enormous, substantial and stable funding, right? But I'm jumping. In the late 60s, early 70s, the women's movement was certainly started and getting fairly hot, quite political in New York. You belonged to a consciousness-raising group, for sure. I had already joined a group called Media Women, which was one of the first activist feminist groups in media, and we already knew the issues that, the things that women couldn't do in the industry, as well as the image of women that was being portrayed. So those were the two sides of the twin serpents, if you will. The ceiling for jobs and the image. And of course they go together, as we know. If you don't fix the image, you'll never get the possibility of getting the jobs, because you're not seen as someone who's capable of doing it. So those are very intertwined, and you find that going throughout the whole period. And Media Women was great. It was there were some quite well-known people. Susan Brown Miller was in that group, and Letty Pogrebin, Sally Kempton at the time. Anyway, these were journalists and writers, and some television people, not that much. And I went to a sit-in at the Ladies' Home Journal. We stormed the Ladies' Home Journal, and we're trying to talk the secretaries there into organizing, and they were just so uninterested. They couldn't have cared less. They were just not ready, not activist at all. It's funny. I watched the series Mad Men. Now, Mad Men takes place just a few years before I started. So I started in 1969. Mad Men at this point is up to maybe 1964. But an enormous change took place in those 5 years. It's unbelievable, because you look at Mad Men and it's just, it's this side of what we were really doing in 1969. But I recently found, I remember the guys coming back from their 3-hour martini lunches and, leaving work at 4 o'clock to catch the 4:38 to Stanford. I remember they had all come out of the networks or the ad agencies. So it was not a dissimilar environment. And of course, everybody smoked everybody smoked everywhere. I don't remember quite as much drinking in the office, but maybe there was. Let's pause a second. I just want.
Okay, so what was it about that was?
I was recently going through some old boxes, and I found the document, the manifesto, as it were, of this women's group at NET that I had written, and it's hysterical. It lays out all the demands, but what I love about it, it refers to us as girls. It's 1970, and I wrote this, and I said, the girls on the corridor, all the secretaries, the girls need a way to move up. And when I saw it, just like last week I came across it, I thought, that's really wild. I didn't even realize. So that hadn't changed yet, which is kind of interesting. So ultimately, I did get onto a production, The Great American Dream Machine. I was still brought on as a secretary, but secretary to one of the executive producers who very sadly had a terrible accident and then was not able to continue working. But so I was loose. I was just, without a secretary without portfolio. So I became a PA, not a good way for it to happen. But that was an amazing experience. The Great American Dream Machine was, it was very creative. It really pushed the envelope of the medium, which is something I must say I've tried to do throughout my career. That's really what makes it interesting, what makes it worth it. But I guess this first production opportunity showed me what that was really about. It was very quirky, very eclectic, short pieces, long pieces, all different styles. And what I did was view everything that was submitted from the outside, all the little animations and quirky documentaries and things from abroad, performance pieces. I would view them and evaluate, and then try to find a way. The shows were thematic. Every week there was a theme. One week it would be the Great American Home or the Great American Car or whatever. And so all of the pieces fit into that theme. And the people running it, again, were a couple of old network people, but the group was very diverse, the staff. And it was a big staff. Not diverse, I have to say, culturally. That wasn't happening, but in terms of male-female, it was, gender-wise. And there were a lot of really smart women who were just a little, half a generation ahead of me, who were already producing, that I learned a lot from and got to work with.
That's what I was going to ask you. Were there women in higher positions then already?
Yeah, definitely. Even before I got on the Dream Machine, there were women producers at NET. Now, it was public television, so because it wasn't commercial, you immediately had an environment that was less pressured about money. Okay, less pressured about money and power and the equation of the two. So, since it wasn't so much a bottom line situation, it was a mission organization. There was, I believe, more room for women to accomplish things. I do believe that. And once I got into production, once you made that leap beyond the secretarial pool, then I never felt gender issues on the production side of public television. There were a lot of really talented women doing a lot of terrific things. In fact, some of the women directors who were the early directors who finally got to do something in Hollywood, or some of the early even documentary directors, they all came out of public television. It's where they got their start in the 70s, a lot of them. So that, I think, was just I just felt very fortunate about that. And the next fortunate thing was, after the Dream Machine, there was an opportunity for a production assistant in the drama unit. Now, when I was in the secretarial row, since I had been a drama major, and that was my love, so all I really wanted to do was work on that drama unit. And I couldn't get anywhere because I had no experience. Now, after the Dream Machine, I had experience, so I did get onto the drama unit. So for me, this opportunity, the chance of a lifetime, really, to bring together my background of theater and my now new knowledge of television production was spectacular. And that really set off my whole career.
That's great. Can we pause for a second and just get a cup and talk a little bit more about New York, since it's for New York, about that environment there? Or, the drama unit. Let's pick up what you were doing there then. What was the difference? We're rolling again. So tell me more about that period then in the drama unit, how that went.
I have to say, it was 8 years of the most fun you could possibly have. It was crazy. We were doing a series called Theater in America, and it was adaptations of plays that were done on stage, but we adapted them for television. And again, I just feel so fortunate because, like the Dream Machine, which was playing with the medium, we did that as well on Theater in America. Now, these are the days when public television wasn't on any rating system. They didn't even have the Nielsen's. Or when the Nielsen's came in, we would get what was it called? BMS, below measurable, ratings. And so we didn't care. So the great richness, the joy and pleasure, and I got spoiled, of being able to sit, like on the Dream Machine, the group would sit around and say, okay, what should we do now? Well, let's see, let's do this. Oh, let's do that, because we had the funding was there, and we would just toss things out, and this person would say, I'll do that piece, and this person would do that piece, and somebody else would do the linking pieces, and that was, again, a privilege. These were the days of great privilege. So that carried over into Theater in America because we had the funding that was Exxon. And we traveled all over the country to the different regional theater companies and decided what we thought were the best productions, and then proceeded to translate them for television. But we really did translate them. We were theater-based, so we used the play. We didn't change the text. But what we did was open them up. We never did it on a stage. We did it either in a studio with real sets that looked like the real house, the real location, and then the exteriors we did on location. So, but again, you can't not talk about the technology when you talk about this history, because we were still doing 2-inch tape when we started this. Maybe sometime during Theater in America it moved to 1-inch tape. But you have to imagine shooting out on location on a beach in Connecticut, with a crew of 100 people, and it's 98 degrees in the shade, and you have these humongous cameras. They're just huge, and they're all cabled, back to these trucks. And I don't know how we did it. I really don't know how we did it, but we did. And some of those dramas, great, very, very proud of them. But it was a crazy life too, because I would leave home for a month, and be out on location, and my life was the work, totally. I had my close friends that were from work, and that was it. It was 24/7. Yeah. Before anybody talked about 24/7, that was 24/7. But I was in my 20s and I was having a blast. So it wasn't until I was about to turn 30 that I thought, I could do this forever, or maybe I better think about doing something else. So-
Were things changing though for women? What was going on in the rest of the organization? Was this still the secretarial pool, or was it still sort of, separate? Were women that weren't in production getting in more, or in general, how is it changing?
I think they were, and maybe the people had started hiring more professional secretaries. I don't know, but certainly because of the inroads that we had made, it was more open. It was definitely more open. And again, the unit that I was working on, there just was never any feeling about that.
That's good.
No, not in that
When you moved
drama
from-
unit.
I'm
Of
just
course, the
kind of
drama
wondering-
unit was composed mostly of gay men, so it is a different set of relationships. So you had gay men and women, basically. There were a couple of straight men, but you never. It changed those gender relationships, definitely. In the arts, that's true.
That's
It does change things. But when I was about to turn 30, a friend who worked with me there, we were both sort of the staff producers by this time on the dramas. And we sat down one day, and a lot of people we knew were moving to LA. Through the 70s, there was quite an exodus from New York to LA. And what had started up was TV movies. Movies had not been made for television directly before the mid-70s. And I think the first one, I'm remembering a movie called A Case of Rape with Elizabeth Montgomery. I believe it was the first made-for-TV movie. If not that, then very close to the first. And people we knew, directors who had come out of soap operas, who had come out of the theater and come out of videotape, who had done the kinds of things we were doing. Actually, we were the only people doing what we were doing. No one was doing plays on videotape. No one would have been daffy enough to do that. But we used directors who had the dual experience, who came out of the theater and then had done soaps, so that they learned the 3-camera shooting, and then they had the dramatic background and the technical knowledge to come and do these plays for us. And there was a handful, maybe 4 or 5 directors that we used all the time, because it was a very specialized kind of experience. But some of them had started to go to LA because they thought they could do TV movies. And so my friend who I worked with and I sat down one day and said, we could do this, this is great, but we could go to LA and do original dramas, because we're still doing plays. We're tied to the theater, wonderful as it was. Wouldn't it be fun to do original scripts for television? So we quit our jobs. We loaded up this ridiculous little Fiat, like Okies with the stuff on the back, and drove across country, not knowing what we were going to. We moved into a Oakwood month-by-month apartment in Marina Del Rey, and starved for 6 months or so. As we did little things here and there. But it was very interesting because I'll get to that later. What happened fairly quickly was that I talked to a friend at KCET. There was someone at KCET, which was the West Coast Public Television station, whom I knew, who had worked on a production together. And he said, oh, you're in town. There's this thing that needs to be done. So I luckily got some short-term producing work. And another director I knew was doing a Hallmark Hall of Fame, so he brought me on. So I got to see the commercial side. But what happened ultimately was that the people in New York kept calling us back, because we were the producers and we both left. And they'd have another play that they needed to do, and so one of us would have to go back and do it. And so I really became very bicoastal. Before anybody was bicoastal, we were doing that, going back and forth. And that's when I did one of the things I'm most proud of, which was a play called Uncommon Women and Others by Wendy Wasserstein. Now, this was when Wendy was just starting out. She was a young playwright, just started Yale Drama School, and this was her first play. And the man who ran Theater in America back at WNET had seen the play and thought it was worthwhile, and good for him, for spotting it. He loved the writing and loved Wendy, so he flew me back. Always called, forgetting about the time difference. 7 o'clock on Saturday morning, the phone rings, and he'd say, Jack, we're in LA. Oh yeah, well, never mind. So can you get on a plane today? Blah blah blah. So I did that, and Wendy and I became great friends, and we had so much fun because the play is about Mount Holyoke. She went to Mount Holyoke, and I went to Smith. They're right next door, and they're just sister schools. So we were hysterical, you know. We drove the set designer completely crazy because we kept saying, no, she would never have that in her room. She would have this in her room, and she would have hung it this way. And
did you do it on a set? How did you do that one, that play?
Same thing. We did it on sets in the studio. You know, we built the dorm rooms, and we built the living room of the dorm. But we went outside to get the exterior buildings. We shot it in Connecticut.
3 cameras?
Oh, yes, 3 cameras.
Isn't that amazing that how much people could do with 3 cameras?
Well, the 3 cameras were for the studio stuff. Outside, you kind of did one camera shoots, for the most part. On that, by that time, we were doing 1 camera shoots outside. In the earlier days, we did 3 camera shoots outside.
And were they switching it or just
Yeah,
recording
they were switching
all
it.
3
Both.
and then
You'd have to switch and ISO them.
Gosh,
Because then you'd re-edit like crazy, yeah.
so when did the ratings come in? I mean,
Oh, the ratings had come in the 70s.
Yeah, 'cause
but we
that
didn't
was
pay
a
much attention to
popular-
them.
Yeah, because then, I mean, they were producing things that were popular. I mean, wasn't it a popular station? The series of plays. I mean, people were interested in watching these.
Television was so different. There were 3 commercial networks. That's it. And public television.
Yeah.
And local stations. So that's really it. So you didn't have the competition. So whatever audience we got would be, we really were an alternative in those days, public broadcasting, because if you didn't want to watch what was on the 3 networks, you had to turn to us.
Yeah.
So,
But
they were
ratings
below
always-
measurable standards for the most part.
Really?
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah, they were really
When
little.
you said the commercial side, when you did the Hallmark Master
Hall
whatever
of Fame,
that play,
yeah.
What was the difference? What did you see that was different?
Well, we did it out of Warner Brothers, so I worked on the lot, which was great. So of course, you have all these resources. You know, you need 20 horses. Okay, you need it was about Custer, so you need dead horses. They bring them. You need the uniforms for the cavalry. You got everything. Of course, the budget was, ridiculously much higher, and the Warner Brothers overhead was, 43% instead of 23% at WNET. So the scale of it is the main difference. Production is production.
Yeah, that's the thing. And did you think there was a different kind of, I don't know.
Quality?
Were women treated differently? Was there a difference in the way the women producers were, or the way you were treated, or?
Well, I wasn't producing it.
Well,
I was I had to take a step back to
On
do
the
that.
Hallmark
So,
one.
on the Hallmark, yeah. I was a director friend of mine who was directing
Yeah,
it.
I'm just kind of curious in the
He
world.
brought me on, but no, I don't even think they would have hired me as I was a PA. I had to take the PA job after I had already been producing these things. So yes, it was definitely worse in Hollywood, no question. On the commercial side, A, and B, being Hollywood, but those go together. Yes, it was definitely worse, and it was not the comfortable, easy male-female relationships that we had in New York, at NET in New York.
Yeah.
Because of the networks at this time, remember, one of the strongest arms of the women's movement in media was the newswomen. That's who was really moving in the late 70s in New York.
Yeah.
In the
Were
mid
you
70s.
still in that group, the media women? What happened to
Not
that
so
team?
much. I didn't, once I got into the drama unit, I didn't have time for anything else.
No more active.
No, I wasn't so active anymore but then I moved to
Then you
LA.
moved to LA.
Then I
yeah.
moved
so
to
let's
LA.
start off that plan now. 'Cause
So-
I was curious why it was even necessary, but tell the whole story about why women in film was even
Right.
why you thought you should start it.
Right. No, I didn't start it. It had started.
Okay.
So I moved to LA. I was going back and forth doing these plays. Then a new drama series was starting up based in New York called American Playhouse for public television. Again, Theater in America was over. American Playhouse was starting. Now, the people starting it were all my friends and colleagues from Theater in America. But there I was in LA. So I then went into KCT on staff as the head of drama. So I became the West Coast American Playhouse person, if you will. And once I was settled there, I think I had heard about women in film before. Some of the people that I knew in LA, again, who had come out from New York, were part of this organization. A couple of women I knew were in this organization called Women in Film, and they invited me to a meeting. And I went, it must have been 78, 79, maybe. I went to a meeting, and I don't know, I guess I'm kind of a joiner. I mean, I love collaborating. I love working with smart, accomplished, intelligent women. So it totally attracted me. And as with anything, you get back what you put in. So I decided if I'm going to join, I should really participate. So they were setting up some committees, and I looked at it, and I saw they were having an issues committee. So I thought that interests me. Got myself on the issues committee. And the first thing we decided to do was something I was passionate about and had been throughout, but again, had been kind of diverted from, was the image of women in the media, and particularly violence against women in the media. So we decided to do a panel. And we had a director who directed some horror films and a producer of horror film, because horror films really crossed over. We weren't dealing with straight out porn so much, but films that people who weren't looking for porn would go see, with these horrible posters and the things that happened to women in the horror films were constantly being chopped up into little pieces. And then we also had a psychologist from UCLA who was talking about studies that he had done with men watching images of violence against women and whether they were then more prone to perpetrating violence against women. So it was a very substantive panel. We got about 300 people came to this in a commissariat at Paramount, and I was hooked. And I decided that women in film was something that I could really get passionate about. So I then went on the board. I was on the board from 80 to 82, and then the second year of being on the board, I was president of Women in Film in LA. So the history of that organization, it was founded in LA in 1973 by T.G. Wilkerson, who then became T.G. Wilkerson Cassell. And she was the publisher of The Hollywood Reporter. And in 1973, T.G. talked to a couple of other women and said, women just are not moving in this town. It's a disaster. We have to do something. And they had the now infamous meeting, the first 12 who met at T.G.'s office in 1973 and organized the whole thing. But the fights go on to this day about who was really there, because at least 40 people claim to have been there, but there really were only 8 or 12 or something. So that's kind of a funny thing. But they decided to organize it, and they did. So that by the time I got involved in 79, it wasn't really very old. And yet it was very vital, really vital. There used to be general membership meetings where hundreds of people would show up. That first meeting that I went to, there were a couple of hundred people there. And so, I could see this life and, that it was really robust organization.
Were there any men, sorry to interrupt, were there any men there? Or how did you do any political, what were the results of this? Like, could you actually get some things done? Did you start seeing results?
In those days, there were not male members of Women in Film. That just wasn't open in those days. That has since changed in all the chapters, I think. But in those days, it was just women. And, the mission was to help women's employment, to advance careers, to provide professional development in the education side, and to enhance the image of women in the media. So when I became president, you asked how we could do things politically. one of the things that was interesting to me is that there was a lot of fear amongst the women about doing anything politically because it was a 501c3. It's a not-for-profit professional organization, tax-exempt organization. And within the rules of a 501c3 designation, there are certain things you can't do, like lobbying or supporting candidates. So when it came to those kinds of things, you had to be very careful. Now, I came out of nonprofit, and I was the first president of Women in Film who had come from the nonprofit world. I mean, they were all it was Hollywood, so they were all commercial people. And I knew a little about it, and I knew that there was a line. We could go pretty far with making certain statements because it had to do with the percentage of your budget. So, of course, the budget of the organization was 37 cents. So, it was almost not much of an issue in terms of how much money you were spending on these activities. And this was the days of the ERA. I mean, the ERA amendment was the Equal Rights Amendment was on the table again. And how could we be women in film and not support it, not come out, not use our united voices? So we did make some strides, and we also made some strides on an industry level. I mean, we made a lot of strides, of course, over the years, but just during my term, a couple of things that we were proudest of. We did an ERA march, to the dismay of some members, but to the joy of many members. And I think that conflict still goes on within these chapters. I really do. And there was this is very industry inside, but at the time, the television networks were not allowed to own the programming that they ran. They were just allowed to broadcast it in those days because the programming had to be owned by a production company. So the financial interest in syndication rules, such as they were, that's what was on the table with Congress, because the networks wanted to have some ownership, but it was all, monopoly stuff. Now, of course, they won that, but at the time, and since most of our members were on the production company side, even if they were the studio, they were the production company as opposed to the network. Even if you're MGM, you're the production company and you want to own your product, because syndication was the only place where you really made any money. And if you didn't own it so that you could send it into syndication 5 years after it was on the air, then it was a money-losing proposition. So it was important for our members that we fight this. So we did. We had a really good lawyer on our board, and she was very up on the issue. We sent her to Congress. She gave testimony, and all in the name of women in film. So we were able to do that, and it was very, very gratifying.
That's good.
Yeah.
So you could do some of that. Yeah, I've always wondered about that, how you can do any political stuff.
You need to talk to the lawyers. You need to manage it, but things can be done, and it is a waste, I think, of the combined voices, not to do what you can.
Yeah. What else were you very proud of? What other accomplishments during that time? I mean, that's the ERA March. You were there.
Yeah.
And what else did you? The professional development, the panel. That sounds like it was a really great panel. Do you feel that you influenced some? They were men on the panel, the directors probably. I mean, how does this sort of filter in through the brains of? How does it sort of? I mean, I guess
well,
we're
that's
still
a
working
huge
on
question.
It.
Yeah, I mean, I
We're
don't think that's answered. We're still working on that, but I do. But in terms of the image of women, obviously, it's changed so much. I mean, I talked a little bit about the newswomen, and I remember when I was president of Women in Film. When you're president of an organization like that, you're asked to speak a lot on the subject. And I always used to talk about the validity of a voice, that women's voices were hard for people to hear because they didn't hear them in positions of authority. And if you don't ever hear it in a position of authority, when somebody starts trying to talk to you in authority, you're very taken aback. And this was the problem that the journalists were having in trying to become anchors. They'd say, well, woman can't be an anchor because her voice doesn't sound authoritative enough. And I even ran into this. I had my own experience with it, which is not a moment that I'm proud of. Years later, in like 1990 or something, we were doing a big series at KCET, a documentary series on astronomy, and the executive producer of my department wanted to use a woman to do the voiceover. And now I didn't like the actress that he wanted to use, but putting that aside, I actually said, I don't think the world is ready for. It was a 6-part documentary series. It was 1990. I said, I think we still have to use a man. I just don't think that the voice will sound authoritative enough. Now I hate that I did that, but that's how I felt in the climate. So it took years for women to be able to narrate documentaries and be taken seriously. So anytime that you had the opportunity to, put women on a panel and again, public television was good about this before the networks were. There were women journalists in public television who were, given quite a bit to do and taken quite seriously. And that's the way you have to push it forward.
Yeah,
I think.
And general consciousness raising.
Yes.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
hearing the voice.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. What this is so great to hear these stories.
But the women's I would say something else about women's voice things, and this gives me a good chance to mention this book. I want to mention this book. This book, Women Who Run the Show, How a Brilliant and Creative New Generation of Women Stormed Hollywood, by my dear friend Molly Gregory. Now, Molly was president of Women in Film in LA the year before I was. So I was on her board, and then we remained fabulous friends. And she wrote this book a couple years ago now, and it is the history of women in the industry during the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And it's everything and everybody. It's actresses, producers, directors, the few that there were, very well-known people to less well-known people. It's stunt women, it's camera women, it's set designers. It's really everybody, because it was during those 33 decades that it all changed. That you went from nothing, you went from being little orphan Annie outside knocking at a window to numerous studio presidents as women, as we know we have today. So to some of us, it's still quite stunning that it happened. As Molly was writing this book, she did an interview with me, and I said, this isn't history. This is our lives you're talking about. How can it be history for a book? But that's always weird when you realize that you've reached that point.
Well, it's just so exciting, and also that it's just
a lot has been accomplished. A lot has
Yeah.
been accomplished. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, well, let's see. So what about
So we're at
when you
KCET.
came back? Yeah, KCET.
Well,
You can talk about it a little
I
bit
would
more.
talk. Well, I would talk about moving from production into management.
Okay. Yeah. Let's work on because we're totally off the
Yeah.
book, but I'm trying to pick up some of these things.
Well, I think for me, moving from production into management is where I ran into more gender issues. That's when I got it finally in my own. I mean, I always got it politically, but personally, I hadn't really felt subjected to it until I became like a department head and then a vice president, a senior vice president of the company, which I did at a number of stations. But it's at that level. You talk about women's voices, and one of the things that I had talked about that Molly actually used in the book, because 20 other women talked about the same thing, so she was able to make like a whole piece about it, was actually having your voice heard. And it sounds so weird. There was a cartoon that I loved, a New Yorker cartoon, that shows this boardroom and all these men sitting around and one woman. And the man says to her, "Barbara, I'm sure that was a very fine presentation, but since you're a woman and I'm a man, I didn't understand one word of it," right? And I kept that cartoon on my desk for years, because I would sit in senior management meetings or board meetings, and I felt like I had to talk louder than anybody. Actually, like you had to physically speak louder. And whether I was working in my own department, well, when you're in your own department, you're the boss, so they have to listen. It's different. And I suppose if I'd been the president of the station, it'd be different. But when I prided myself on being fairly clear speaking. I tend to kind of think before I speak and come out with a pretty clear statement, people have told me. And I would find over and over and over, people would just look at me and then move on. And then 10 minutes later, somebody else, male, would make the same statement or the same suggestion that I had just made. And everybody would say, oh, great idea. And you just, it happened all the time. And you're stuck. There's nothing you can do because you're seething with rage. And you can't say, excuse me, I just made that suggestion because it sounds defensive. Like there's nothing you can do that doesn't sound, childish or defensive. So you just have to kind of smile and take it. And that stuff takes its toll after a while. And I found that at a management level, that men knew certain things that women didn't know about being in management. They were better at planning their careers. They were better at dealing with the boss because they were better at playing a hierarchy. I think women, and I'm not the only person to say this, but we as women have tended to believe that if we're just very, very good and we work really, really hard, that we will be noticed and appreciated and rewarded because that's how a meritocracy should work. And it doesn't necessarily work that way in a corporate hierarchy. And that's a very hard lesson to learn. Very hard lesson. For me, it was, and a hard lesson for women, I think. I mean, I had men who would come to me with plots and schemes against somebody else, against another guy in senior man. Say, now if you and I do this, we can kind of, do a back run around him, and I'd be like, say, no, actually, I don't want to play, So, not everybody's like that. I don't mean to make huge generalizations, but I had enough of those experiences, and I saw enough of men knowing how to manage up. They say you have to know how to manage down and manage up. Managing up is managing your bosses in order to be a survivor in the corporate world. And I think women have had a lot to learn about that. I'm sure they're much better at it now, but during this period,
that's the type of panels. Yeah. Now, was that in the Women in Media group?
No.
Oh,
that was an activist group. Okay. But I could just talk about women helping women.
Yeah.
Over the years,
So we'll roll again. The period of when you're still in New York, so like 69, late 60s, early 70s. We're talking about. Okay. So tell me more about that. The relationship of other women and what was going on there.
When we organized the women's group at NET, at National Educational Television, in 1970, as I said, there were quite a few women who were a generation ahead of us who were already quite accomplished. They were producing. And those of us who were activists, who were starting this group and making all these demands, we were the hungry ones. We were the ones who wanted the opportunity to move up. But you would have thought that the more accomplished women would have been there holding our hands, moving us through. And it wasn't really that way, as I recall. We'd have these meetings, and we'd be rabble-rousing up front, in the front of the auditorium, and these older women would be standing in the back, just not quite sure about what these youngsters were, making all this fuss about. I think to some extent they felt that they had done it without a movement behind them, without all of this, these demands. They had just done it with that hard work and getting recognized for their value. And they also probably felt they didn't want to make waves because maybe they weren't too secure about these positions that they had achieved, and that it could go away at any time. So they didn't want to roil the waters. I think, and I hope, that has changed a lot. in terms of women helping women. Now, an organization like Women in Film has had an enormous amount to do with that. It gave women a safe place to help each other, where it wasn't threatening that you were going to lose your job because you also were given the safety net of the support group, of the professional development, of the people who you could commiserate with. And that, if the women, these earlier women who were successful at an earlier time, were quite isolated in terms of women, because there were so few of them. And it took the consciousness raising movement with just getting women to talk to each other, which I believe led right into Women in Film, which was getting women to talk to each other about their professional situation, in the media. And those are very, very tied. And now we can't imagine a world without Women in Film. It's an organization in every city, whether it's LA or Washington or New York, Atlanta, it's everywhere. It's worldwide, of course, but it's still a safe place. But it now is open to men in most places, and it has become just a support group for everybody, particularly independents, I think. And again, particularly in Washington, it's really about independence. And New York, probably the same. LA will always be different because LA isn't the home of independent producers. It's the home of networks and studios. So I don't think that that's ever going to be the kind of, in Washington there's a listserv. There's this wonderful listserv, which I think is just, like the greatest thing. And I need a PA in Baltimore on Monday, or I need this, or this one's offering that, or does anyone know how to fix this? It's an incredible, incredible resource. But what that is a resource for independence, for people who are fairly isolated, for the most part. The people who are inside the big companies, if you're inside Discovery, if you're inside National Geographic, you don't tend to need that because you can call tech support, So the organization in Washington, I think, has that particular flavor for independence. In LA, you couldn't do a listserv like that. It wouldn't make any sense. But it still is difficult. I mean, I do believe that women are helping women a lot more than they used to, because they don't feel that the few jobs, that it's as rare. It's not as rare for women to achieve. So if they don't have to be, terrified that that this other woman is a threat to them. See, that's what it was in the early days. As much as men coming up could be threats, other women could be threats too. But I think what happens in terms of the organizations, and I know this is true every chapter that I've participated in, is the difference between the people inside in network and studio and giant production company jobs versus the independents in terms of the membership, because it's very hard to get those two groups to talk to each other. And I've seen this in LA and I've seen it in Washington. The organization has difficulty, at least in those two chapters, getting the highest level people in the industry, the highest level women in the industry, to be active in the organization. Because when they reach a certain level, they don't feel they need it anymore. The chapters tend to be full, the volume of members tends to be independents or people coming up. And I remember in LA, when we'd have studio executives, in significant positions, and they'd come to an event and they would be just horrified because there were too many wannabes running up to them saying, "Oh, can I call your office? Oh, will you read my script?" And they would just run, because you can't allow that, to happen. So the organizations continue to have this issue of how to provide something worthwhile still for the most accomplished women who are inside big companies who don't need the kind of resources that the independent does, and still provide the professional development for the more up and coming or independent people. I think it's a constant tension.
Yeah, it's true. We kind of skipped over coming back
Skipped
to
over about
Washington.
30 years, but that's okay.
That was good though to bring that up, because I think they do want to know about women in film. You know what?
Yeah, I thought they
But
did.
so when you came back to Washington, how did you move into that role? And that's when you did talk about the management,
Right,
difficulty. But
right.
how was it for you here? Was there a women in film group that you joined right away?
Yeah, I should mention the Women in Film Foundation, because it's another thing that I'm really proud of. In LA, in the early 80s, when I was president of Women in Film in LA, a couple of the past presidents from before me and some other members had started an entity called the Women in Film Foundation. And it was going to be an offshoot which would raise money to give out to women for various programs, a foundation. Because the Women in Film organization that wasn't something that they did. They were desperately trying to raise money all the time and get money and stay alive and fill the operating budget. But the idea of the foundation was to be more educational, more involved with the larger community beyond the membership. And that way you could raise money, because it's very hard to raise money for operating funds for a professional organization. People don't want to give to that. If you're a membership group, get your money from your membership. I mean, unless you're doing programs that are open to the larger community and have some educational value or some mission value beyond advancing the careers. Yeah, we'll have to pause. Yeah. So can you edit? Do I have to start again with that, or you can edit?
Pick up from
The Women in Film Foundation was set up to do educational things beyond the community and okay.
Beyond the community. I mean, I can edit though, so we can roll again. Okay. So tell me more about the foundation then. Why it was set up.
The foundation was set up to be able to raise money from sources that would never fund the operating budget of a professional membership organization, different kinds of sources, and to do educational programs that would reach a larger community beyond the membership. So it wasn't as self-serving, because this organization can be seen that way by funders. So the foundation had established a board and started to do some projects. And one thing that when I was not president, when my president term was over, I went onto the foundation board. That's kind of what was happening. We called it the glue factory. The past presidents went onto this foundation board, so you could continue being active, but it wasn't as day to day. President of this organization, as everyone knows, is a big job. So on the foundation board, I wanted to pick a project that I cared about, and I said to my colleagues, what women really need in this town, in Hollywood, is something to show. Because if a woman wants to be able to direct, particularly, and has absolutely no work sample, you can't move. You can't get off square one. So something to show was kind of the password. And I said we need to create a finishing fund to help women finish their movies. Documentaries, shorts, whatever they are, they need that kicker to get it finished. Now, we knew we'd never be able to raise enough money to really fund a movie, so that's why we made it a finishing fund. So we created the Film Finishing Fund, with a lot of F's, the Women in Film Finishing Fund, Women in Film Foundation Film Finishing Fund, even I can't do it. And we knew that people would submit, and whatever we could give them, they would have to guarantee that they were going to finish. They'd have to really be at the final stages. And I remember talking to one friend of mine who was a vice president at Universal at the time, and she was on this foundation. And she said, well, what can we give them? How much? We're not going to be able to raise. I said, but these people we'll give them $2,000, $3,000, $5,000, whatever we can come up with. And she said, $2,000, $3,000, that's nothing. She said, I could fund that on my expense report. I said, well, why don't you? Because that's an enormous amount to these filmmakers. If somebody's making something for $30,000, then the last $5,000 is huge to them. But again, I came from nonprofit and public broadcasting, and they didn't think that way. So this was really kind of my baby. And with Molly, worked very hard on it, and another friend, Diane Aslan, we kind of put it together. And I kind of stole the Corporation for Public Broadcasting guidelines and NEH guidelines for creating a nonprofit program. And we started it, and it's still going. It's almost 30 years.
That's great.
Isn't that amazing?
And it's run by the LA office?
It's run by LA, by the Women in Film Foundation.
Yeah.
And the Film Finishing Fund is still going. The foundation's definitely still going. But actually, Film Finishing Fund is its major activity. They've also done some oral histories and other things. But this is the one that has the legs, the Film Finishing Fund.
And that's the other purpose of Women in Film, too, is to give each other opportunities and the whole networking thing.
Oh, absolutely.
Does that happen? Tell me, what are the other why do we need a women in film organization besides being isolated and independent? Tell me some other reasons, benefits.
Still now today, why do we still need women in film today? I think it has transformed a bit because we're not fighting the fight for access in quite the same way that we were. And that's the good news. The good news is that the access is much better. That doesn't take away the need for mutual support. It just doesn't. That continues to be there. The sharing of resources continues to be there. And I think what starts to happen is the awarding women for the achievement, not just clawing to be able to get the achievement, but how about now we reward each other? And all of the chapters have gala ceremonies for their awards, and they're very lovely and very gratifying, and they allow women who have achieved to have their moment in the spotlight. And I don't think anybody else is doing that for us yet. So there's lots of reasons to have women in film.
So we'll go back to the LA again. Let's see. Tell me a little bit more about the finishing fund. What it funded, how you got it going.
The Film Finishing Fund was very special because this was also during a time when government funding for the arts was being pulled way back. It's never been great, but it was a particularly bad time in the early 70s with the recession. And in the early 80s. Now we're now in the early 80s. And being able to support women making something was really very, very important. We were able to raise some money from individuals in Hollywood because they had it, and if you could convince them or guilt them. We never got as much from the studios as we should have because they didn't get it. And a couple of foundations, but mostly from individuals. In the early days, it's all changed, and I haven't been involved with it for some years now. But the other thing that we were able to do was get the donations of post-production services. That was actually easier for us to get because we'd go to the post houses, and they would donate nights and weekends, or they would donate the audio or something. But that was huge. Now it meant that in the early days, it meant if you got one of those grants, you had to be in LA to do it. So it stayed kind of LA centric for a while, which always frustrated me because the foundation is national. The foundation's there for everybody. It's not a chapter thing, really. And the Film Finishing Fund certainly is for everybody. So when I came to Washington, I really pushed to get people to pay attention to it, just to submit here. And we did get a post-production grant from Rowland House when it was in business, and a couple of other places, so that a couple of Washington filmmakers have been awarded. You had to submit your film, but when they won, at least there was a Washington-based place for them to to do the work.
Yeah.
So it's something that Washington could do more of. And New York, I don't know if New York pays attention to the Film Finishing Fund.
I'm not sure, really.
I don't know if they do.
Yeah, but having that work sample, something to show and a calling card
Critical.
is always really important, and that's what I think people are still doing, and that's
Yeah.
why I think it's such a great organization. It's just the networking and having opportunities. I was at a panel. I heard a young woman speak, and she was asked a question about why she hasn't made more films or something, and she said her confidence, she said she just wasn't, she thought she could make a film, but she just didn't have any confidence. And I thought, wow, I wish she didn't have to still say that.
Yeah.
She was young, maybe in her 30s, but people still talk about that. And Jodie Foster was giving a talk and at the Designing Women, and that came up again with why aren't there many women directors?
Oh, the directors.
Yeah, why is it that directorial role is so hard for women? I mean, they need to have practice doing it. I mean, that's why finishing funds, and even if it's small projects, just to keep doing projects. But do you think?
Well, at the time we started the Film Finishing Fund in the early '80s, the other thing that was happening. Women in Film was very active, but also the committees, the women's committees of the Writers Guild and the Directors Guild were acting up. And that was critical, that period, and that activism, because what they did was they commissioned studies, and they came out with numbers. And as soon as you saw those numbers of the percentage of women who were writing for movies or writing for television, and the percentage of women directors, which was a joke. I think it was, it was like back to the old Nielsen rate, below measurable standard, right? It was insane. And once everybody looked at it, they kind of scratched their heads. Now, there was not immediately some great, upheaval and let's hire a lot of women directors, but at least you had something to point to say, this is unconscionable. And it also gave women in film more ammunition. So we worked closely with the women's committees of the guilds at that time. Directing has always been the hardest. It's always been the hardest because it is the person who is put out there with $1 gazillion of responsibility, and they just didn't believe that women could handle the money. That was one thing, or have enough authority on the set. We're back to the voice again. Can a woman really run a set? Will the crew listen to her? Those were the issues. It seems absurd now, but those were serious issues. Not to mention the women's sensibility. Then the women's sensibility came into it, and she could only direct love stories, and the endless. Thank God for Catherine Bigelow. Here we are now finally, and she made such a huge leap. So there are lots more women directors now. I don't think it's as much an issue. I don't know if the women's studio heads, how much they can point to, whether they've brought on more women directors. I really don't know. I'd be curious.
Question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, so let's go then to
Get me
DC.
to
What did
DC.
you do?
Yeah.
How did you get that? I don't know if you want to.
On the plane.
Yeah.
Because
it's really about your accomplishments here, and
Yeah.
that's when you went into management from production, I guess.
At KCT. No, at
that's
KCT I was the senior vice president of production. So I was running a division there, and that's when when I at first gone to KCT, as I said, it was in connection with the drama series American Playhouse, and I was the head of drama. After a couple of years, I became the head of production, documentaries and cultural, everything. So that's when I got more involved in documentaries, but I wasn't producing them. I was executive producing them, or had executive producers under me over the years. So I was there for about 12 years at KCT, and just putting out many, many hours of programming from our division. And I had been doing it for a long time, and I started to miss the creative relationship of just me and a product. So I started painting. That's what I did, because I needed just an outlet that in fact wasn't I love collaborating, but collaboration also meant managing everybody. And so I needed to be alone with something creative. And so I started painting. I mean, it really happened because my dear husband said, I was always thinking about leaving the city and moving to the country, moving to a small town. And my husband's a writer, and I would say to him, what am I going to do in this? You can write, and you could do what you do any place. You could do what you do on the moon, doesn't matter where you are. But what I do is completely dependent on this business and these other people. And he said, well, what would you want to do? Could I say, well, yeah, maybe I'd be interested in painting. So he immediately signs me up for a course, right? And that was wonderful, and it kept me going for several more years, really. And then I started to get that itch again that that I wanted to be making things. So I left the job at KCET, and I thought I was leaving public television. I had been in it, and it had been fabulous, fabulous career to that point. I was very proud of everything I had done. I didn't feel embarrassed about anything that I had foisted on the American public. I felt good about what I had done, but I felt like I needed to go in a new direction. However, after a year in LA, I really wasn't sure what that new direction was going to be, in all honesty. And I had this opportunity to come back east, first to Maryland Public Television. That was the company that brought me back east in that same position as head of production, and that wasn't the greatest fit. But after a year, fortunately, they offered me the job at WETA, W-E-T-A, in Washington, D.C. So I went into the same job, essentially, there. And that was wonderful. But I needed a change, but I didn't realize that I could stay in the same industry and kind of change places, because WETA had just different kinds of things. I was working with the Smithsonian, I was working with the Library of Congress, I was doing concerts at the White House. So Washington, I got into the Washington-ness of it, which was just different. I mean, I had loved the LA-ness of KCET, but this was different and really fun. And I worked with some wonderful people.
And on arts projects.
Arts projects,
so.
Yeah, history projects. Ken Burns projects were under our department. And
so what does the job exactly entail? This is sort of from the list too, for like head of production. You're making sure that people are staying on. Well, just maybe at WNET or here. KCET, or you had to manage all these people, but you had to know your stuff about production too. It was creative and administrative, I guess.
Yes, the job, that kind of head of production job inside one of these public television stations, which is a rarefied, job, rarefied situation to begin with. It involves a number of things. Your job is to get things made, is to keep the product flowing, if you will. Keep manufacturing your core business in a way that stays on budget, that makes money for the station, and enhances the image of the station. And that is, you're looking at quantity, and responsibility on budget. So you have to, you and your staff, you come up with ideas. You also receive ideas from independents, from the outside. You figure out if they are fundable, financeable. It's a lot about putting the money together. We always used to say, oh God, fundraising is the worst. Just, you got a good idea, and it would take years, literally, to put the funding together for a major project. You say, if we could just get into production. This was sort of more in the earlier stages when I was actually in the field producing. And then you'd be in production, and you'd be, in some hideous place, having been up for 24 hours and saying, oh, take me back to fundraising. It was much easier than this. But anyway, you fundraise, then you put a production staff together, because you could never maintain enough people on staff to do all the projects. You'd have to bring in freelancers. And that's what you do. You make sure that everybody does what they're supposed to be doing and does it on time and on budget, and that it's good quality. So the quality control is what keeps a person in that job very close to the programs, because I read every proposal, I edited every proposal, I edited every script, I worked on every rough cut. I mean, nothing left the shop without my stamp on it. So yes, so that was very gratifying at that level. But you also have to put up with all the other stuff. You're dealing with the fundraising, you're dealing with the network, you have to deal with the public relations and the outreach and the which is fun, and the station relations, because you're within a whole system, within a network. So and I loved the international work, which I did a lot at KCT and at MPT and at WIDA, because co-productions were a critical part of making the financing work, always an important part.
Can you give some examples of those that you're proud of, the co-productions? I don't know if there's any particular series that you want to mention, or international.
There was a series that we did at KCT that I was pretty proud of, called Millennium, Tribal Wisdom in the Modern World. And that was a co-production with Canadian producers and the BBC. And it was 10 hours in the days when you could do a 10-hour series. And the executive producer was Adrian Malone, who had been the executive producer of Cosmos. So that was great to work on. It took us 10 years to raise the money. 10 years we worked on putting that money together, and then 2 years of production. So that was kind of extreme in terms of fundraising, but you could get those.
It was a wonderful show.
Yeah, it was pretty good.
What other? I should mention a few. Well, now, okay, after WIDA, then you've been, maybe we can go into that.
I think it's time to go into that, because
that's a huge.
That has the really huge change came when I left WIDA, once again with the itch to do something different, because at that time it had been 30 years that I've been a PBS executive or producer. Although, I have to say that I never really wanted to be an independent producer, because where I was sitting, they were all coming in, please pick me, and they were the ones spending years, who could use the $2,000 to finish their film, who were writing proposals, and I was so sympathetic, I was overly sympathetic, and my heart would break for how hard and devoted, the work was. And I thought, I'll just stay here, thank you, because I don't see how I can do that. But then at a certain point, the older I got, I thought, well, I've done that for the safety and security, and I've loved it, but it isn't the same as, sitting down with the one project that you're passionate about. So, for the past 8 years, I've been making my own films, and that's been the huge change. Yes, I knew how to do it, because I'd done. You had asked me earlier if being in management, if you need to know what all the production roles are along the way. I think people have different opinions about that. Having come up, having worked my way up from the bottom, I did know what everybody was supposed to be doing. And I always found that very useful. I thought it was important for a manager or an executive to know that. Many people move more laterally, and they don't have that particular kind of experience. So it probably works both ways.
Yeah. So that's.
So I wanted to. So yes. So sorry.
And we could pause for a second.
Okay.
Yeah, and you sort of could choose.
I didn't take on things at the station that I didn't want to take on.
Yeah.
I could make that judgment.
Yeah. So how is it different, or what have you done that you liked, that you're proud of?
Well, it's very different working in my basement, and I don't have to get all dressed up every day, and I haven't worn high heels in years, and that makes a big difference. I have all these old suits, all my old executive, suits sitting in the closet, which are probably so out of style, but I keep thinking, well, I might need one day, so I better just hold on to them. But little by little, every year I get rid of a few more of them. So when I left WIDA, I didn't go on my own immediately. I went with a company called Mandalay Media Arts, which was starting up in LA. And I thought that would really be fun because I was going to be their Washington person. But it would get me back to LA and see all my friends. And I did. I was back and forth every 6 weeks or so. So that was wonderful. And it lasted about a year. It was a documentary company starting up to do HDTV, which I had really done a lot at WIDA. I got involved in the very early days of high definition television in the mid-90s. And I was completely committed to it. I was an early adopter and an early convert, and I pushed WIDA into it. There were other people there who were interested in the broadcasting side, in the HDTV broadcasting side, but I was really the one who pushed on the production side. So I'm pretty proud of that too. And you made some of our loveliest programs. So I had gotten to know some people in this HD field who were the pushers and the pioneers in the HD field, and that's who I went with, Mandalay, when I left WIDA, because I had these relationships. But the people with the money behind that company, I don't know what, somebody told them that they could make money off making documentaries, but they soon learned that wasn't really the case. So that company didn't last too long, unfortunately. But it did kickstarted me into my independent phase of my career. And I started hooking up with people on projects. I mean, there were some people who had brought me things at WIDA that weren't going anyplace in public television, but I kept up the relationship and we worked together. And you mentioned the one on Nikola Tesla. That was one of the projects that I worked with. A producer had been working on it for years and it just wasn't quite ready for prime time. So together we were able to bring that to fruition, and it went on PBS quite successfully. And then with that same producer, we did another project together called Korean War Stories, which won the Emmy that year in '04 for the best historical documentary. So I thought, well, this is cool. I could do this, and continued. Yeah, after the next one after Korean War Stories, I did one by myself. Again, relationships and old friends and old relationships are just what it's all about. I worked with a woman I had known for years who had been married to Carl Sagan, who was Carl's wife. Andrianne was her name. And we had known each other back since the Cosmos days. And we both wanted to do a project on the Voyager mission because she and Carl had worked together on the record, the golden record that was created of the sounds and images of Earth and the music, and that record that was attached to the side of the Voyager spacecraft that is still traveling out in outer space, out past the sun. I mean, past the heat rays of the sun. It's the farthest thing that's ever been sent by man, and it's still out there traveling, way beyond the solar system. And so Annie, she was executive producer, and she made a deal with A&E, which at the time decided that they wanted to do some science programs of quality, which was a short-lived mission of A&E, but we snuck in there, and that was really great for me because here I was doing something for cable, for the first time that I was actually doing something for cable, and the amazing thing was they said, yes, we want this show, here's the money. And that was just stunning. I mean, that just never happened to me before. I'd always have, if PBS would say, yes, we want the show, then it would start the years of the fundraising. And they just gave us the money. It was unbelievable. So we made the show I'm really, really like, called Voyager. Well, it's actually called Cosmic Journey, the Voyager Mission and Message. And I got to play with science and the arts, which you and I have talked about and really like, because it was all about the space mission and the whole history of it. And we worked with JPL, a lot of great old footage, and talked to the engineers and scientists. I let the story be told by the people who were there, no narration. But then also juxtaposed it with the story of the making of the record and the images and the music from the record. So it was a kind of hybrid piece, and again, pushing the form. We talked a little bit about that's what makes it worth it in the end, is being able to push the medium forward in a way. And so this was one of those where I got to play. And then that was nominated for Best Science Documentary for the Emmy. That was very cool. Didn't win, but we lost out to The Pill. Those GBH people, the Nova had done it, or Frontline I think it was, had done a show on the pill. You know, it was the anniversary of the creation of the birth control pill. So we lost out to the sex show, I like to say. It was a good show, of course. And then I got involved with the woman that I'm still working with now, Mary Lynn Evans, who was making a series called The Appalachians. It was a history of Appalachia. And she had done a lot of shooting, and she'd worked with a couple of different producers, but she hadn't found the right person. And WETA actually put us together.
Hi.
Uh-oh.
We'll pause for a second. I
We
know
better
we're
pause.
Yeah, it's not as crucial as a broadcast show.
No, of course not,
It
but-
doesn't have to be silent. Okay, we're rolling again. Okay, so what else?
So Mary Lynn had been working on a series called The Appalachians, which is a whole cultural, economic, social history of Appalachia, which really hadn't been done. And she put the money together, and we made this 3-part series, again for public television, and it was very successful. It became a pledge favorite. A lot of stations around the country pledged it, and it made money for the station, so one always likes that. And she and I worked so well together that we decided to do another film, which was kind of spun off of the Appalachians. If you tell the history of Appalachia, a lot of it is the history of coal, because that's been the boom and the bust, if you will, of Appalachia for 150 years. And what's happening now with coal and the energy crisis in this country, the environmental crisis, and the horror, the rape of the landscape that's going on in Appalachia with mountaintop removal, coal mining, the way coal is mined. The mountaintops are blown up, and the coal is taken off the top, as opposed to, these are seams that you can't get at from underneath, so they blow off the top of the mountains. And to the enormous damage of the environment, the air, the water, the valleys, streams that have been lost forever. It's really horrible. So that's the film we made, and we put together the money to make that. And we worked with the Sierra Club and Earth Justice and a lot of terrific environmental groups. And Coal Country it went on Planet Green. It was run on Planet Green, which is one of the Discovery networks, their environmental network. It's fairly new, but they were great to work with. But it continues, and the Sierra Club did a huge outreach campaign around Coal Country. It was their main issue for a year, and the film was the signature of their coal campaign. And it's still playing. I'm going down to Charlottesville on Wednesday for another screening, and then going out to Aspen next week for another screening. So it plays all over. But the Sierra Club did house parties. You know how they have these house parties where Sierra Club members can get the DVD, have people come over to their house, watch the film, and have a discussion. And they had about 850 house parties for Coal Country, yeah. So it was really great. So I have, in recent years, been able to be my own boss, collaborate with people that I choose, and have the direct relationship of writing. I'm writing, producing, and directing these films. So I kind of say I went backwards in my career, because most people start off doing the producing direct, and then move into management. I know a lot of producers who then go in and become executive producers at Discovery or something, but I went the other way.
Well, this pushing, so the pushing the form, before, what do you think of what's going on now with the media? So much media, it's almost like, it's almost lost its power sometimes, or the quality changes. And what do you think about the field now, or do you have any, I mean, you wanted to push the form, but also keep the quality. So I don't know if you,
Yes,
if you want to
and
talk
I
about
think,
that now.
well, I think, yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, pushing the form, it meant something different in that day because it was linear. You had linear videotape, and that's what you had. And so to push that meant something quite different. We were doing green screens, blue screens back in the day when it was really, really new. So there were things like that, but I couldn't possibly comment on the whole media scene. Now it's too humongous and too complicated. But I think you're absolutely right that there's no locus. I mean, there's no people call it the water cooler effect. There's no one thing that everybody would have been watching, or four things that everybody would have been watching and talking about the next day, unless it's a viral YouTube. I mean, that's the closest you get is the viral video that everybody's talking about. But of course the upside of that is that anybody can do it. It's not controlled by anybody. It's not edited or overseen or managed for quality. That's the upside, and that's also the downside. So where are the places where you can use the properties of the medium to the greatest effect for some sort of artistry? There aren't very many places. There aren't very many places. And I think those things tend to then fall into smaller categories. You can do it, and you can just put it on the web. But it's like you and I were talking about a little bit, you have to be able to do everything because you're not going to raise budgets. You're not going to raise funding, financing for those kinds of pursuits. You're going to shoot it yourself. You're going to edit it yourself, which is fabulous. I mean, I came up in the days of the serious gatekeepers, okay? And I was very privileged to be one. That's the way I look at it. I was very lucky to be in a place where we were the gatekeepers. We'd say, we want to do this, we want to do that. No, we don't. We like it this way, we like it that way. And, and there's an arrogance in that where you think you know what's best for the audience. We don't have that anymore in quite the same way. And that's the good news because it is more democratic. However, we do of course still have people foisting things on us that are pretty horrible. I can't even believe some of the things I actually watch, but I don't watch The Real Housewives of DC. I can tell you that. And then once one of these formats kind of catches on and they realize it's cheap and it's easy to make and it gets an audience, then you just you're besieged with it. So yes, pushing the envelope of the medium has taken on different meanings. It's actually pushing more violence, to a great extent. It's pushing more violence, pushing more sexual content, pushing for the sake of pushing for sensationalist reasons, as opposed to pushing an envelope for formal experiment, shall we say. Yeah. It's hard to find a place in any sort of commercial environment. Right. Even public television, formal experiment, hard. Graphics, fancier graphics, fancier production values, yes, definitely, because the audience expectations are high. I mean, I think we're in an odd time where it's a real dichotomy, because on the one hand, audience expectations of production level are very, very high. I mean, you're in the world of Avatar. I mean, you watch a science documentary on Nova, or one of the big ones on Discovery, where they spend some money, and you expect spectacular stuff. graphics, recreations, they're huge and they're very, very expensive, and you don't want to make it less because you won't be competitive. On the other hand, it's the viral video that costs absolutely nothing, that's probably getting more views than the super duper production value historical recreation of the Middle Ages. So it's the audience is really very, very split. Very, very split. And who knows where it's going to end up.
Yeah, it's a really odd time, isn't it?
Very odd. And I don't think anybody can get their hands around all of it.
Yeah, I know. And we're not going to talk about the whole public broadcasting system now.
No.
Anyhow, but the one thing that I thought was really good too, like the effect of having all these women in the business, and the one of the things that management, maybe it's probably still at high levels, very male dominated, but I think it has really
in the business.
changed. Yeah,
in
the business.
The commercial business, yeah.
And commercial, and just in general, management style. I mean, management training, sensitivity training, and like at Digitas, they have all these meetings all the time. It's very collaborative. The generational thing, it's just a different world now. But I really think a lot of that is is because a lot of women got into the workplace, and I wonder if you have any comments on that, like how it has affected the, not just the media industry, but I guess we can focus on the media industry. I mean, has it changed? Maybe that's why it's so democratic now, or I don't know if you can make any connection with.
I don't know how democratic it really is. I think I think a couple of things have happened in the corporate world. I do remember when I worked on the show, The Great American Dream Machine, in the late 60s, early 70s. We were the 60s generation. I mean, not only were we agitating for women's rights, but we were the 60s generation, period. And we were not interested in hierarchy. It was all about the collective, right? And so we used to drive those bosses crazy, because we set up, and we had this big open space for an office. It was like an old ballroom, and we set up this pit, the conversation pit. And every time anything had to be discussed, we'd say, everybody into the pit, because we thought we were going to be able to run this thing as a collective, because that was where our mindset was. And I'll never forget the day the executive producer said, "Excuse me, this is not a democracy," right? And I thought, oh, really? And so I learned something about hierarchy. But then, you get to the 80s or the 90s certainly, and the kids, the young people who were founding Silicon Valley, they did make it more of a collective. They did break down, collapsing the layers of hierarchy. That has happened, and it's happened in new technology. I think to an extent it happened with women, because as women came into management, three things. 60s generation, I think, continued to do that, because they were more psychologically oriented, had more attuned to interpersonal relationships, as were women. So that started to change the way people talk to each other at work. Diversity, cultural sensitivity, multiculturalism as it grew up, also led to more sensitivity, if you will, more inclusiveness in the corporate culture. And then you get to the Gen Xers, who were really founding these places where they ran around in Bermuda shorts, and they probably all did jump into the conversation pit every time something had to be. But interestingly enough, that also rewarded individual innovation to such a degree. I mean, I'm sure they worked as groups, but they really, really, really supported the person who was going to go out there with the next great idea. So I think all of those forces of the last 30 or 40 years, you can't separate them, but they all have something to do. And who knows? If you're at GM today, I think it's still not a democracy.
Yeah. And then the film business is kind of a hierarchy anyhow.
Yes, it is.
A director has to be maybe that's one of the...
Oh, on the production side, yeah, it is, but on the corporate side it is too.
Yeah. So, okay, any last things that, accomplishments that the whole thing of moving HD forward, that was a huge accomplishment. That's right. You were right in the middle of that.
Yeah, yeah,
Ken
I remember.
Burns started doing his thing there. You did a lot there, Weta, to get it rolling. I mean,
He did. Well, Ken was already there
yeah.
before I
Oh,
came.
he was.
Yeah, yeah.